The late afternoon sun poured through the window of our modest suburban home as I stood in the kitchen, finishing a cup of coffee. It was my sanctuary, a small reprieve from the growing distance in my marriage to Kelly. We'd been together for 6 years, a second chance for both of us, and while our love had once burned bright, it now felt like a flickering candle. She was a successful attorney, always busy, always preoccupied, leaving me with plenty of time to reflect on my shortcomings. At 45, I'd grown into a quiet life, trying to make peace with the fact that passion wasn't as present in my world as I'd once imagined it would be. My role as a step-parent was new territory, especially with Patrick. Patrick, my 22-year-old stepson, was Kelly's son from her previous marriage. He was everything I wasn't at that age: confident, self-assured, and effortlessly charming. When he visited, the house seemed to come alive, though I often felt like a supporting character in his world. Patrick lived a few hours away, attending university and only coming home for occasional weekends. Our relationship was cordial, if not warm. He treated me respectfully, but never gave much of himself emotionally. I understood. I was the outsider who had entered his family after his father had long left the picture. Kelly and I shared a quiet, predictable rhythm, though cracks had been forming in our marriage for years. Our conversations had become little more than logistical updates: bills, schedules, and the occasional comment about work. Intimacy was rare, and even when it did happen, it felt forced. I often found myself craving connection, someone to notice me, to see me. Kelly, for all her accomplishments, no longer seemed to have the time or energy to offer that. I loved her, but the version of love we had now felt hollow, a faded memory of what it used to be. When Patrick returned home that weekend, it caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him until the following week. He walked through the front door with his usual casual confidence, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder and a wide grin. "Hey, didn't know you'd be here," he said, his deep voice filling the room. I gave him a small smile. "Yeah, just me for now. Your mom's working late tonight." We exchanged a few pleasantries before he headed upstairs to settle in. Despite his easygoing demeanor, there was always something about Patrick that left me feeling uneasy, a strange mix of admiration and insecurity. He was the kind of man who commanded attention without trying, a quality that I envied and found unsettling. That evening, I found myself alone in the living room, flipping through channels but not paying attention to anything on the screen. Patrick had gone out to meet some friends, leaving the house quiet again. My thoughts wandered, as they often did, to my marriage. The emotional distance between Kelly and me felt insurmountable at times. I wondered if she noticed it too, or if she was simply too busy to care. Hours passed, and I decided to head upstairs. I'd taken a shower earlier and left my clothes in the bedroom, intending to change before bed. Wrapped in a towel, I walked into the room, letting the steam from the bathroom follow me. The sound of footsteps in the hallway startled me. I turned just as the door swung open. Patrick stood there, his expression frozen in shock as his eyes met mine. Time seemed to stand still in that moment. I felt the blood rush to my face as I registered what had just happened. I was standing in the middle of the room, completely naked, and Patrick was rooted to the spot, his eyes wide. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice unsteady. I grabbed the towel from the bed and wrapped it around myself, trying to salvage what little dignity I had left. "It's fine," I muttered, though my heart was pounding in my chest. Patrick's gaze lingered for a fraction of a second longer than it should have before he turned and hurriedly closed the door behind him. I stood there, breathless and confused, my mind racing to make sense of what had just occurred. In that fleeting moment, something shifted. The shock and embarrassment were undeniable, but there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore, an electric tension that left me feeling exposed in more ways than one. Alone in the room, I tried to shake the feeling, but it clung to me like the steam in the air. Whatever had just happened, I knew things would never quite be the same again. The house felt heavier after the incident, as though the air itself had thickened with unspoken words and unresolved tension. I spent the next hour in my room, replaying the moment Patrick walked in over and over, trying to focus on the embarrassment to push away the strange spark that lingered in its wake. I couldn't shake the image of his face, his wide eyes, the faint flush creeping across his cheeks, the way he hesitated for just a second too long before retreating. When I finally ventured downstairs, I found Patrick sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up briefly as I passed, offering a clipped, "Hey." His voice carried a cautious neutrality that only deepened the awkwardness. "Hey," I replied, forcing myself to sound casual, though my heart was racing. We didn't speak much that evening, each of us seemingly trying to avoid acknowledging what had happened. The tension between us, however, was impossible to ignore. Patrick kept his distance, and I noticed the way he avoided looking directly at me, his gaze darting away whenever I entered the room. I told myself it was just residual discomfort, that he'd forget about it soon enough. But a small, shameful part of me couldn't stop wondering what he thought, what he'd seen. My thoughts betrayed me, wandering in a territory I had no business exploring. I hated myself for it, for the way my mind lingered on his fleeting glance, the faint hint of curiosity I thought I'd seen in his expression. I was disgusted with myself, yet the feeling refused to dissipate. Later that evening, as I tried to distract myself with cleaning up in the kitchen, Patrick wandered in. He was carrying a small toolkit, and for a moment, I thought he was going to avoid speaking to me again. Instead, he cleared his throat and said, "The bathroom sink upstairs is dripping. I figured I'd fix it while I'm here." I nodded, grateful for the normalcy of the moment. "Thanks. I hadn't noticed." He set the toolkit on the counter and began sorting through it. "Yeah, it's no big deal. Just thought I'd take care of it before it gets worse." As he worked, I couldn't help but watch him. He moved with an effortless ease, his focus entirely on the task at hand. It struck me how grown-up he seemed, no longer the awkward teenager I'd first met when Kelly and I got married. Patrick had grown into a man, and the realization was both unsettling and something else I refused to name. When he finished, he turned to me with a small smile. "All done. Shouldn't be an issue now." "Thanks, Patrick. I appreciate it," I said, genuinely grateful for the distraction. He lingered for a moment, his expression shifting slightly. "You seem quiet tonight. Everything okay?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't like Patrick to ask personal questions or show much interest in my mood. I hesitated before responding, unsure how much to reveal. "Just a lot on my mind," I admitted finally. He nodded, leaning against the counter. "Yeah, I get that. I've been dealing with some stuff too lately. School's been rough," and he trailed off, his usual confidence faltering. I looked at him, surprised by his vulnerability. "And what?" He hesitated before continuing. "I don't know. It's just relationships are complicated, you know? Trying to figure out who I am, what I want. It's not as simple as everyone makes it out to be." His words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. For a moment, I felt a strange kinship with him, a connection I hadn't expected. "Yeah," I said quietly. "I do know." The room fell silent, and I became acutely aware of how close we were standing. It wasn't just the physical proximity. It was the way our conversation had stripped away the usual barriers, leaving us exposed in a way that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Patrick's gaze lingered on me a moment too long before he looked away, his cheeks flushing slightly. "Anyway, I should probably head to bed," he said, his voice strained. "Good night," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. As he walked away, I felt the weight of my guilt pressing down on me. I'd crossed an invisible line, not with my actions, but with my thoughts. I told myself it was just a moment of weakness, a fleeting lapse in judgment, but deep down, I knew better. The next day brought more opportunities for avoidance. Patrick kept himself busy outside, and I threw myself into chores, desperate to distract myself. But by evening, we found ourselves alone again. The house was quiet, Kelly working late as usual, and the hum of the television filled the silence between us. At some point, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. Seriously? Patrick muttered, getting up to check the fuse box. I followed him with a flashlight, the dim light casting long shadows as we navigated the basement. The confined space only heightened the tension, the proximity making it impossible to ignore the way his presence affected me. When he turned to face me, the flashlight catching his features, I saw something in his expression that mirrored my own turmoil. Uncertainty, curiosity, and something else unspoken. For a moment, neither of us moved, the air thick with unacknowledged desire. Then he looked away, breaking the spell. "I'll figure this out," he said, his voice tight. I nodded, retreating upstairs, my heart pounding in my chest. The moment hadn't crossed any physical boundaries, but it had left me shaken. Whatever this was, it was spiraling beyond my control. The evening was unusually still, the kind of quiet that amplifies every small sound, every stray thought. Patrick and I were alone again, sitting in the dim glow of the living room lamp. The power had returned earlier, but the unease from our basement encounter lingered like a shadow between us. He sat on the couch, his head tilted back against the cushions, his gaze fixed somewhere I couldn't follow. I sat on the far end, pretending to focus on the TV, though neither of us had paid it any attention for the past hour. The space between us felt charged, an invisible thread pulling tighter with each passing moment. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," I said, finally breaking the silence. Patrick turned his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, about figuring out who you are, what you want." My voice was steady, but my heart was pounding. He shifted, sitting up straighter. "It's just, I don't know. Sometimes things don't make sense until they do. And when they do, it's like everything else feels wrong." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I knew I should have stopped then, should have walked away before the moment unraveled further. But something in his voice, in the way he looked at me, felt like an invitation I couldn't ignore. Without thinking, I moved closer, the couch creaking softly beneath me. Patrick didn't pull away. Instead, he held my gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of curiosity and hesitation. "This shouldn't happen," I said, barely above a whisper. "I know," he replied, his voice just as quiet. The distance between us dissolved as though neither of us could resist the pull any longer. When our lips met, it was tentative at first, a fleeting brush that sent a shiver down my spine. But it deepened quickly, passion overwhelming reason. Every sense felt heightened. The warmth of his skin, the faint scent of his cologne, the sound of our breathing breaking the silence. It was electric, intoxicating, but laced with an undercurrent of guilt that gnawed at the edges of the moment. A sudden vibration startled us both. Patrick's phone buzzed loudly on the coffee table, its screen lighting up with an incoming call. We pulled apart, breathing heavily, the spell broken. He glanced at the screen and muttered, "It's Mom." The weight of what we'd done crashed down on me all at once. "Kelly, my wife, Patrick's mother." "You should answer it," I said, my voice strained. Patrick nodded, grabbing the phone and walking toward the kitchen to take the call. I sat there, frozen, the taste of him still lingering on my lips. What had we done? When he returned a few minutes later, his expression was conflicted. "She's on her way home," he said quietly. "Good," I replied, though the word felt hollow. As the night wore on, the weight of what had happened became unbearable. Patrick and I barely spoke, retreating to separate corners of the house, each lost in our thoughts. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in my mind. What had started as an unspoken tension had spiraled into something I couldn't take back. The guilt was suffocating, but beneath it was a flicker of something else, something dangerous. When morning came, I found Patrick in the kitchen, sipping coffee and staring out the window. He turned when he heard me, his face unreadable. "We need to talk," I said, my voice heavy with the weight of our shared secret. He nodded, setting his mug down. "I know." We sat at the table, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. "This can't happen again," I said firmly. "I wasn't planning on it," he replied, his tone sharper than I expected. But then he softened. "Look, I don't know what last night was. I'm still trying to figure it out. But it's not something I can deal with right now." I nodded, the ache in my chest growing. "I'm sorry, Patrick. I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," he said, standing up. "But it did." He left the room, and I was alone again, left to grapple with the consequences of my actions. Kelly came home that afternoon, her usual whirlwind of energy filling the house. I smiled, hugged her, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, I felt fractured. Later, as I stood in the quiet of the backyard, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly life could spiral out of control. I had crossed a line I never thought I would, and there was no erasing it. The damage was done, and the weight of my choices was mine to carry. Patrick would go back to school, and life would return to its predictable rhythm, but the memory of that night would linger like a ghost, haunting the edges of my conscience. What did it mean to love, to desire, to betray? I didn't have answers. Only the heavy silence of a secret I would take to my grave. "This can't happen again," I said firmly. "I wasn't planning on it," he replied, his tone sharper than I expected. But then he softened. "Look, I don't know what last night was. I'm still trying to figure it out. But it's not something I can deal with right now." I nodded, the ache in my chest growing. "I'm sorry, Patrick. I never meant for any of this to happen." "I know," he said, standing up. "But it did." He left the room, and I was alone again, left to grapple with the consequences of my actions. Kelly came home that afternoon, her usual whirlwind of energy filling the house. I smiled, hugged her, and pretended everything was fine. But inside, I felt fractured. Later, as I stood in the quiet of the backyard, I couldn't help but reflect on how quickly life could spiral out of control. I had crossed a line I never thought I would, and there was no erasing it. The damage was done, and the weight of my choices was mine to carry. Patrick would go back to school, and life would return to its predictable rhythm, but the memory of that night would linger like a ghost, haunting the edges of my conscience. What did it mean to love, to desire, to betray? I didn't have answers. Only the heavy silence of a secret I would take to my grave.